I do have to ask, by the way, so Death Must Die, was that by design for you guys? Were you trying to like get a shock factor so you could bring in more people, or like what was the concept behind the name of the game?
Oh, okay, so the name was initially just a placeholder because whenever we're starting a project, I gotta create a repo, so I just make up a placeholder name. I usually want it to be catchy, and this one just came to me. And then when we had to set on the actual name of the game, because we were making a Steam page, we kind of just didn't come up with anything better, so it kind of stuck.
That's fair.
I mean, it's catchy, it has a call to action, memorable. Some people don't like it, but grows on you, I don't know.
I was about to say, I can't imagine you wouldn't like it, because as soon as you see it, it pops out. It's like, I don't know, when I was scrolling through Steam, I mean, it was definitely one of the titles that like jumped out to me. I was like, oh, I gotta click on that and see what it's all about. And here we are. So, I mean, it definitely works.
It was a good choice. It was a good choice.
When you guys made your Steam page, did you make it like super early, or did you make it later down the road? What was your strategy there? Because I mean, you already had the game out.
Fairly early, because so this game is kind of in development from the start of this year, and I think we had the Steam page out around March or something.
Oh wow!
Because I know it's good to have your Steam page out as soon as possible. There's no downside to having your Steam page up early, because even if you're not marketing it, it's just passive wish lists.
Yeah, agreed. So you guys started this project like early this year? So you've been working on it, what, for about 7.5, 8 months now?
Something like that, yeah. There was a bit of pre-production before that, I think 1 or 2 months. But yeah, heavy development about the start of this year.
Is that by design? Do you try to go into a project and you're like, we got to get it done by X amount of time so we can move on to the next thing? Or, because I know with your first game, you had said that you kind of tried to keep that to a minimum with development as well. So is that by design for you guys?
Well, I think most people that start projects, especially if it's not like a side hobby project, if you're like, we're going to make this commercial, we want to sell this, you kind of have a vague idea of how long you want to take. Because if nothing else, you have like money, like it's savings or a budget or something. Like this is our second game, so I'm saying usually, but yeah, like usually we have some vague idea of how long we want the project to take. I think we're kind of strict with that because we haven't worked with a publisher so far, so we kind of gotta watch ourselves that we don't overscope. With the first game, we did overscope a bit, but it's like by game development standards, it's nothing. It's like we were planning on doing it, I think, in 6 months, and then it took like 9 or 8. I don't know.
That is very, I mean, that's like being very strict in game development standards. Most of the time, people say like 6 months, and then like a year and a half later, they're like, well, you know, there's things that got added on. So I mean, yeah, that's impressive.
I think there's a conundrum there because you kind of like, it's one of those things that you gotta balance well. Because on the one side, there is a benefit to taking a long ass time to make a game, and it's that a lot of the really good indie games, they take a long ass time. Like if you look at, just off the top of my head, let's say Return of the Obra Dinn, Stardew Valley, Hollow Knight, like all these games took years and years.
True.
And in a lot of cases, the developers kind of, I know for Obra Dinn, Lucas Pope just planned to make that game in like I think 6 months, and then it took him 4 years. So, but if he didn't take those 4 years, it wouldn't be a good game, I think, because it's just the kind of game where it takes a lot of experimentation and super polished, like super well done. So yeah, there are benefits to being less strict with yourself.
You're right, but I think because you guys did game jams before this, I believe, right? Yeah, so the developer who did Sucker for Love, which is like, it went bonkers, like people went crazy over that game, I think it was last year, he did game jams as well, and he pushed his title out, I think in, don't quote me on it, but I think it was a couple months as well. Like it was under a year, I believe, or like just over it. So he pushed pretty hard as well. So maybe, I mean, obviously, yes, every developer works differently. So sometimes, you know, you want to take years and years. Sometimes you want to take a couple months. But I do think it is impacted by how you enter the industry and the standards you kind of evolve around. If you're in a game jam, there's pressure to push something out fast. If you're in, you know, just a solo dev on your own or a small team, then maybe you're focused on like the quality and you're thinking about all these little details, and like then it starts growing and growing. So like I don't know, maybe different mindsets, different, you know, environments, whatever it is. But I mean, whatever it takes.
When you say it like that, I think like my general advice would be like for developers, at least for developers that would need it, is I think when you're kind of new and starting out, shorter projects are strictly better. Because someone who's making their first game, like a 4-year project, you're gonna make a lot of mistakes at the start of that project that you're going to be dragging on for a long time. And I don't think you'll probably have that good of a game in the end, because you get your lessons from the project, and then it's best to kind of wrap it up and move on to the next one. So maybe, like, you're right that like on the game, the good thing about a game jam is, especially when you're inexperienced, it kind of forces you to put something out. And being strict with yourself and having a short time frame and like following it can really help I think a beginner developer such as ourselves, right? Because I don't think taking like 4 years for our previous game would have made it that much better of a game. I think we kind of exhausted what we could do with it, took our lessons and moved on.
I have to ask, so you started out with a visual novel and now you're in a roguelite. So what was the decision making there, right? Because that is a big jump. Like there's a lot of differences between visual novels and roguelites. Was it because like visual novels were kind of in at the time, or was it just like we want to make a game and this is the first idea that we had? What was the thought there?
When we brainstorm, we kind of just have like, we don't really lean towards specific genres that much. So when we were like brainstorming, I remember for the previous game, like on paper we were taking like a boomer shooter, roguelike, card game VN, tower defense, like it was all over the place. So I don't think we kind of analyzed the market or anything. We just liked the pitch of the game, because the idea was card game plus visual novel, where we try to capture that sense of being a kid and playing Magic the Gathering in your local club. So that just sounded really nice to us, sounded like something we can do in a short time. We kind of lean towards that. By the way, in this case, actually, it's weird because we don't play that many visual novels. I've played like, maybe before Kamifuda, I'd played like 2 visual novels in my life. Which was, by the way,
one, so I'm in the same boat.
That's not very good decision making on our end, because obviously if you're going into a genre, it's good to understand it. Like if you're going to design something, number one stop is go play as many games in that genre as you can and analyze it, right? And we kind of really underestimated what it takes to make a visual novel. Because like looking at it from outside, it's like, oh, it's just a book and you have portraits and so on. But so much of that game's development was just like directing all of the scenes, because we have like swipe animations for the characters, moving out of scene, sound effects. Because like I was the guy putting in all the sound effects, and I'll tell you, it takes so much time. I didn't really do a good job. I don't think I did a good job, but I tried, and it took so much time. Especially if you have a big visual novel like 40,000 words or 50,000 words, it's insane.
I know visual novels, like a lot of people look at them and they're like, well, it's probably like the easiest game to make, and when in reality, there's so much production behind it and there's so much that goes into it. I mean, it's a massive undertaking. And visual novels, I've always felt they have a stigma that goes along with them, so a lot of developers steer away from them because of that as well. So there's like layers on top of layers for why you would pick that specific, I guess, genre in itself, and you guys were like, just let's go for it, you know what's gonna work out.
Sounds cool.
But I mean, you know, it was your first game and ultimately it led you to this project, so there's always a reason, right? From a technical standpoint though, I mean, visual novel, there's not a lot of character movements. I mean, the way you approach the game engine behind that to this game, I mean, everything I would imagine is different, right? When you're moving from that to where you are now. Like
speaking from a programmer's perspective, like for the previous game, I would say most of my technical work wasn't in the visual novel part, because like you said, that's more art content, directing, like sound effect work. It was the card game, because like Kamifuda is a card game plus visual novel, and the card game actually has a lot of mechanics. A lot went into that, like AI logic for all the different conditions and so on. Took up a lot of time. And so I would say the biggest carryover into this project is old games have a lot of mechanics that kind of trigger based on conditions and so on, like stats and stuff like that. So this sort of complex system that lets you make synergies in different builds. We kind of have that in both games, so that's one thing that kind of carried over on my end as a programmer. And from the art department, like this game also, it's not a visual novel, but it has those Hades-like portraits, which I guess somewhat reminisce of Kamifuda, and obviously Renier, who is the character artist, is using a lot of the stuff he learned from Kamifuda when he's drawing these portraits. But a lot of the other stuff is totally different, right? It's no longer a turn-based game. It's pixel art now, which is a whole other bag of worms.
It's pixel art. It's a kind of a top-down viewpoint for the most part. When you're coming in from an art standpoint and then you're designing this game, its levels, its combat, like everything across the board, what are the constraints when you go into a project like that, when you want to do something this way and then you realize like maybe you can't because of those limitations within that pixel art style?
I'd say one benefit of the pixel art style is that it kind of makes some things easier. We're a very art-heavy team. We have, like, there's 3 of us, and I'm the programmer and there are 2 artists. So when you use pixel art, it's like an easier way to sort of make the game more consistent visually, right?
Yeah.
Because when you have different artists drawing, if you're like using a more traditional line art style, it's a bit more difficult because you have more freedom in the shapes and so on. So that's one thing that makes it easier. Outside of that, the isometric view definitely does land some constraints, and I feel it like, especially in the environments, there are a lot of places where we're struggling with like how to, like, if we want to have tall objects and the characters gotta move behind them, like how do we conceal that? Like how do we make it so it doesn't look annoying? And another thing is that, like, the artist who is doing the environments, he's really fucking good. Like, his stuff is amazing, but it's kind of hard to do like these super amazing like money shot pieces when you're isometric. Like, we have some really nice environments, but if this was, let's say, a 2D Metroidvania, then you can always have the background, which is like super nice. You can draw anything you want there. But in isometric, you gotta think about the camera, what's obstructing the view, and how you can lay things out. And we had to do a lot of redos because of that, like the lobby in the game, where you spend a lot of your time. This is actually a second version of it, because the first version had a lot of visual obstructions and it wasn't clear where you're supposed to go. So yeah, there are some problems, there are some advantages.
All 3 of you having that art background, I would imagine it's kind of hard to take a step back and focus more on like the mechanics and the gameplay than just like making something that's visually beautiful and like that you can really enjoy visually as you're playing it. That's got to be a little bit of a learning curve for you guys, just to watch it kind of unfold in a different, I guess, artistic style.
As a programmer, it drives me insane at times, because it's always like you do something and then they're like, but this is like 2 pixels offset. I mean, it doesn't look good. We gotta add this. So much time goes into the details. Like you wouldn't imagine. Like, if it was up to me, most of the stuff I just leave it like first thing I plugged in. But in the end, the game is better for it. Like, I think the artist did a really good job. It looks amazing. I love how it looks. A lot of work goes into that.
So you're on the programming side of things. It's a horde-based combat game for the most part, I would imagine, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so when you're creating hordes and they're all like just rushing at your main character, there's gotta be a lot you gotta think about from a programming standpoint, where you're trying to balance everything out, you're trying not to overwhelm the player, you're trying to make sure that your NPCs are like in a relatively, they're not too easy, but they're not too hard. I mean, there's a lot that has to go into that. So walk me through how you approach the combat in this game from a programming standpoint and from a player standpoint.
That's one of the things that we kind of struggle with design-wise. Okay, so from a programming standpoint, obviously, like, one big issue is crowd movement and obviously performance, because I know it's a 2D game, but we're trying to target very low-end machines as well. And when you have like several hundred enemies moving around, I don't want to have some kind of super complex AI behavior every tick there, right? Because it would be insane. And from a design standpoint, it's kind of really hard to balance, as you say, because if there are too many enemies on screen, then you can't focus on the behavior of the individual enemy. So it's the basis of the genre that we started from. We're kind of somewhat shifting away from it, where we have more active enemies, we have enemies with different behaviors, and we've made the player more maneuverable. He has dashes, he has attacks, and so on. But we're still kind of struggling with finding the balance, where we do want that sense of cleaning up a horde of enemies, where you're like wiping them out, killing a ton of them, like, and you're in the sort of cathartic state where you're just brain off killing a shit ton of enemies. But we don't want it to be super mindless, so we're trying to sort of alternate where one wave is like more enemies, they're kind of weak, but then the next one you gotta find against a few stronger enemies. One thing that works is where we have elite enemies which have the complex behaviors, and they're like sort of focal points for the player, right? And everything else is just super basic, easy to kill, low-level enemies that you kind of just clean up.
Have you ever like gotten to a point in the game where you made this horde and they're all coming at your character, and all of a sudden you realize, oh shit, we made these guys way too strong and they can't get past them? Is that something you guys run into a lot or no?
Yeah, like the balance goes over the place all the time. Like some of the things, because we have a demo right now. We've had it since the Steam Next Fest. Some of the things in there which people are still complaining are too hard. They used to be like 10 times harder. It was insane. Like, cause and this is a complaint we had with our previous game as well. Usually Renier does the balance, and he always balances it super hard. Like, it's almost impossible. Like, I don't think I could have beaten Kamifuda without him helping me. It's still so hard. Yeah, it's still super hard. There's still reviews in the Kamifuda Steam page, people complaining about how hard it is. And this game, we're trying to be a bit more reasonable, but still usually the default is like Renier tries to do something that he thinks is reasonable and it's like impossible for mortal beings, and then we nerf it into oblivion for the final version.
But that's like a trend with indie games, I feel, because most indie games traditionally they're played by like hardcore gamers, and then as indie games have become more, I don't know, accessible, casual gamers get into it, and then a lot of people feel that are more casual, they're like, whoa, this is really, really hard. When the reality is kind of, I'm not going to say is typical for the genre, but it's something that is widely like known by people who play a lot of indie games. They're like,
because it's not like a AAA game where it's super market driven, where you have people analyzing, oh, this is too hard for everyone, just remove everything. You have people who play games making games, so it's you kind of lean towards that.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, and plus for you, I mean, it's a roguelite. If it's too easy, then you're just like cakewalking through it, and then all of a sudden it gets boring. So I mean, it's kind of like it's by necessity almost.
And that's why we have all these difficulty adjustment mechanics, right? That's the cool thing about roguelites, is you have systems that let you progress outside of the runs themselves, that adjust your difficulty. That's probably one reason why roguelites are so popular as well, because it's a self-adjusting thing. It's super addictive, and it eventually get better no matter what you do, because you're grinding.
I feel like a lot of people don't realize that it does self-adjust as you move and progress through the game.
But that's the difference between roguelike and roguelite, right? Because roguelikes have no out-of-game progression. It's just hardcore. You get one life, do what you will.
You're done. With this game, do you guys have like a difficulty system as you go in, or is it just the one difficulty? It's not like easy, medium, hard, or anything like that. You go in, it is what it is, and then it kind of changes and evolves as you go through the game.
Yeah, it's not a sort of, we don't have some kind of hidden difficulty adjustment system. It's less subtle than that. It's kind of, there are sort of two things playing against each other. You have the base game, and then you have your meta progression, which are these items that you grind, kind of like Diablo, which make the game easier because you get stronger, right? Because whenever you start a new run, you have stats, but if you have items, you'll be stronger from the outset. So that's the way you make the game easier for people who struggle. Like, if someone's good at the game, they can probably beat it on the first few tries. If they're not good, then they can grind some items and go in stronger. So once you beat the game like that, something we have planned is a sort of manual difficulty adjustment where you can put add a challenge for yourself. It's going to be like a challenge screen where you
can
put
make
points into it
almost for yourself.
Yeah, you make the game harder for yourself based on different, like, make the enemies stronger, make them faster, stuff like that. And what you get in return is you get better grind. Like, it sort of increases how much item drops you get and how much gold you're looting from the game. So these two systems are like, the game gets easier if you grind, but you can also make it harder if you feel like you've reached the current difficulties limits.
And it creates that creates replayability as well. So people, when they beat the game, they can go back and continue playing it. So that's a really good idea, actually.
Hades has something similar. That's our main inspiration, I'd say, for the darkness system, like the difficult. A lot of games have something similar. A lot of roguelites eventually run into this because people beat it and they're like, we want more. It's too easy. Give us more. So we're giving it to them.
So with this game, it's your second game. your first game, when it released, can you talk about kind of learning from that game's release, how well that game did, and then moving those lessons into this one as you're getting closer to your release date?
We definitely learned a lot marketing-wise, in that some genres just sell better, and some games are just a bit too niche. Because our previous game, it kind of combines two genres, but it doesn't combine them in a way that's very compelling for a lot of people. Because like a lot of visual novel players, they just want to read, and a lot of card game players, they just want to play the card game.
I see.
And those two don't mesh that well in Kamifuda. So, and the fact that like both of those genres, I guess, like the way we combine them kind of lead to a sort of niche audience. So for the previous game, we really tried to market it hard.
Yeah.
We were posting all the time, like Reddit threads, Twitter, so on. And by the end of it, we didn't have that many wish lists. Like I've heard it's good to have like 3,000 wish lists on release, at least. Like it's good to have. It depends on your investment, but
yeah.
Like it's like a lower bar if you want to sell anything.
That's the starting
we couldn't
point,
even.
right?
Yeah, we couldn't even reach that. We had like 2,000 and something when we released. For this game, we haven't done any marketing at all, and the game like broke 100,000 wishlists just participating in the Steam Next Fest.
That's wild.
And I guess the biggest lesson is, if you have a game that nobody wants to play, it doesn't matter how well you market it. It just obviously marketing is important, it helps, but it's easy when you're an indie developer to become super invested in what you're making. And to be like, no, people are gonna love this, they just gotta give it a try.
Yep.
And that is definitely true for some games.
Yeah.
There are some games need marketing because they're like hidden gems. Like maybe the game doesn't look good, or it really shines with the gameplay. And those kinds of games, they can get overlooked at first because they come out and nobody buys them. But if somebody does buy them, they blow up because they're actually amazing games, right? But sometimes you just have a game it's kind of both niche and it's kind of mediocre. And in those cases, like, it doesn't matter how much marketing is sink into it, it won't really, like, it won't change anything.
It is tough because there's so many games releasing every single week, every single day.
Yeah.
And
It's
you need to kind of be like right place, right time, right genre, right time. It needs to look good. It needs to feel good.
Yeah.
It needs to have like an impact on players when they just see it for the first time. You know, that like call to action, the wow factor. Kind of like your guys' title with your game right now. You mentioned you were on Steam Next Fest with this game. You know, then that helped a lot with your wish lists. Was that something that you had done for your previous game and it just didn't work out, or was this
we
like
were on?
Really?
Yeah, we were on Steam. Like we did the same things we did with this game, but more. Like, but it didn't.
I mean, that's wild to me. That's fascinating.
Yeah,
especially the number. I mean, 2,000. I mean, that's wild.
Yeah, 2,000, and then for this one we have over 100K, and it's like because I was hoping that by the end of the fest we will have like 5,000 wishlists. Like that was my big hope, and then I'm
like 2 hours later
wake up and we broke 5,000 in a day, right? And it's insane.
That had to be a good day.
Yeah. By the way, you get used to it eventually, because at first you're like, oh my god, we broke 5,000 wishlists, and then
it's never enough. Yep.
Yeah, after a while you're like, oh, just 1,000 wishlists today. Oh, okay.
Yeah. They're like, man, we gotta up these numbers, you know.
We got up these numbers. Yeah.
Yep.
It's never enough.
So, I mean, imagine if you spent, 2 years on your first game, 2,000 wish lists, you probably would have been in a very different place with this game than where you are right now, right? I mean, just based off of that, like, logic and that reasoning, pushing it into this game.
Well, we probably couldn't spend that much on the first game because we wouldn't have the budget. But yeah, like, I imagine the first game, like, pushing its development several years down, and I think it would have been a better game. But not like geometrically, so not enough to sort of push that threshold. And because it's always a risk reward thing where you can push those extra years, but if you don't make back that investment, and I'm not just talking about money, because like it's a time investment, like spending 4 years on a game, like spending 4 years on a project, that's a big chunk of time.
It's a huge time suck. I mean, you never get that back with this game. You've got a lot of wish lists right now, and so ultimately the question kind of shifts from like hitting that wish list benchmark to how do you get those wish lists to turn into actual like game buys at the end of the day when you do release. So is there, I know you said, there's no marketing on this guy, you're all just all in on development, but is there kind of in the back of your mind a strategy to shift those wish lists into buys and to keep them like invested in this title? Or you're just like, when it comes out, it's going to speak for itself and they're going to buy it? Kind of what's the thought there?
Well, yeah, that's always been our strategy, kind of. If the game delivers on what it promises from the demo, I think those wishes are going to convert. Maybe our main worry right now is content, because we're just 3 guys, and kind of expectations for what an early access game is have shifted over the years. So people expect a lot more content nowadays from an early access game, even a fairly cheap one. I hope we can deliver on that. So I think if we just make a good game, those wishes are gonna convert, and consequently, if we keep updating the game during early access, because obviously we plan to have a lot of big patches, we have a lot of content planned for early access.
It is interesting because I think early access like 2-3 years ago, I think people would have had a more severe reaction to games that release, and they would always be like, oh, they're half baked, they're not finished. But nowadays, I almost think it's an expectation with a lot of games and developers, because almost every game nowadays they release, I think with like CD or disc games versus digital games nowadays, that kind of like paved the path for this, where it was like the game releases, then there's a huge patch, then there's another patch, then there's an update, then there's, content extensions and things like that. And it's just something that's kind of accepted within the industry. And I think with that, disc to digital was a big part of it. Games like Cyberpunk, which in the AAA space just completely bombed at launch and then kind of redid itself, or like Battlefront 2, things like that, like massive titles that ultimately they weren't early release, but they were full releases that had to be massively helped on the back end. They kind of paved the path where it's like you can release a game nowadays, even as an indie developer, and it can have, minimal content, and then you can build on it. But then it's a double-edged sword, because once you release that game, you never get that full release or that early access full release back. And if people fall off the bandwagon, they potentially never come back. And I think Cyberpunk ran into that problem. So it's like, yes, you can, but is it a good idea? And to what extent is it a good idea?
Well, I think you kind of do get the full release, though. Because if you plan to go into early access, right? Because Cyberpunk that was the full release. They just rushed it out. But
which is I think that's after so many delays. But
well, they obviously not the developers. It's just mostly management issues. Making a game that huge, it just has a lot of places where the workflow can break.
I always tell people, marketers and developers, they're on completely opposite ends of the spectrum. Developers are like, we need some more time, and marketers are like, well, but let's push it, And then all of a sudden people are like, well, why isn't it out now then? And the developer's like, because we're nowhere close. And the marketers are like, well, but we're kind of close though, right? So it's like all of a sudden there's that weird meshing. And I think in AAA you run into that much more than in indie, because in indie your title better than anybody, so when it's ready, when to announce it, when to push the market on it. So it's a different ball game, it really is, but it is something interesting to look at and see as it unfolds within the industry, and it's something that's become much more relevant within the last couple of years as well.
I think with this is kind of something I've thought about a lot, because I used to have a more corporate desk job. I think with big enough teams, another thing you can fall into is sort of development hill, where the productivity of the individual team member drops off so much that the game just starts moving at a horrible pace.
I see.
And I feel like a lot of big companies suffer from this. For instance, when you shuffle a lot of people out of the team mid-project, I think CD Projekt Red had issues with this, where the crunch was so bad that a lot of people were leaving. And they have money to hire more people, but it's you can't just hire more people. It doesn't work like that. They replace the old ones, but the new people aren't familiar with the tool set, aren't familiar with the workflow, and so you kind of have this amorphous mass that is kind of losing and gaining people, and it's the actual development inertia is super low, and the individual person can barely contribute anything because his workflow really drops off.
It's interesting, and I think AAA ran into the problem recently, I guess not even recently, over the last few years as well, where I think in the industry as a whole, gaming is as popular as it's ever been. I mean, it's exploded within the world market, and people are pumping money into it right now all over the world. But I think as developers and programmers especially, there's not enough programmers and developers to meet that demand. So I mean, as you mentioned, when developers leave a team in AAA and there's massive expectations, all of a sudden there's the question of, well, where are we going to get developers and programmers? And even if you can get them, then the question is also, you know, do they have the same skill sets and abilities that my last guys and ladies did? And it's like, maybe you do, maybe you don't, you know? And then there's a lot of question marks behind that as well. And that's why, like, a lot of smaller studios sometimes will just get bought up because you know they have the skill set and the ability. So you're buying them for their skills, not so much their titles.
Yeah. I'm kind of speaking as an outsider because I've never been in the AAA industry. There is the fact that most experts, like most professionals in the industry, retire very early. Like, kind of the industry is leaking talent because the work conditions are so bad. Like, there's so much crunch and bad management that people are just leaving the industry forever because it's not worth it. So when most of your people are retiring, like in their 30s, you're gonna have a deficit of talent, obviously.
Yeah, but you guys have a lot of crunch on your game, I'd imagine, too, right?
Yeah, we crunch like crazy.
Yeah,
but
it's different when it's your game, though, right?
But well, yeah, it's insanely different because we're not kind of employed to someone. We're just a bunch of friends making a game, and like, first of all, we're not all crunching. Whenever you feel like taking a day off, if it's in the middle of the week, you just do it. Yeah. Like some days are like, hey, let's get together to play video games today, and we just go play video games. Yeah. Right? Yeah. But it's like, I remember on my old job, when I had to do like just an hour of overtime, it felt like soul crushing, right? Because I just want to go home. I don't care about my work. I don't like it. It feels super draining. And right now I'm like, I work 10-12 hours a day and I'm fresh. I go to sleep like a baby. I don't feel tired or anything. It's weird, very different. It's very different. Like, if you believe in a project and if you're doing it for yourself, your mindset is totally different when you're putting in the extra effort. Yeah,
which is interesting. I mean, that's a great take right there. So with this game specifically, right, you guys, you know, you're not to release yet, but you're getting closer. As you get closer, this game is controller compatible, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so with controller compatibility, is there the mindset that you want to port this game to different consoles as you get to that release date, or even like, you know, post-release date? And if not, you know, when you get to that release window, what platforms you see it releasing on, and kind of what's the strategy as you get to that point?
So the controller support, I think two primary reasons for that are Steam Deck is one, because I think that's pretty big. And another is simply that I think a lot of people like playing games with controllers. I know I do, because when I've spent all day just typing away at the keyboard, I kind of just want to lean down on the couch and play with a controller. So if a game has controller support, it's like 10 times more likely I'm going to try it in my free time.
That is true.
So those are my main reasons. I kind of did it for myself and for, like, because the Steam Deck looks kind of going to be big. Outside of that, we do plan console releases, or at least we want to have them. But I don't think that will be coming until the end of early access. Because I don't think early access kind of works on those platforms. Like, people, I think, for instance, on the Switch or the Xbox and the PlayStation, people expect a finished game. Like, I don't even know if there's a similar setup there. So yeah, most likely yes. I don't know if I'll be porting the game myself or if we're gonna like outsource that or something.
Yeah, are you gonna port it with publishers, or you're gonna outsource it? What was your thoughts there?
To be honest, personally, I would prefer to use like a publisher, because I just like the porting stuff. There's a learning curve there, because for every platform you gotta get like a development kit, you gotta set up your company there, so it's a lot of paperwork that I don't want to deal with. Obviously the porting itself is also work, but not as much of a hassle as these things. So if we can get some publishers do that, it would be great, I think.
If you guys, I mean, because a lot of developers run into this thing where they're a little bit hesitant to get a publisher, I think, early on in their projects, because then they're worried the publisher, will try to take over a little bit of control of their game. Maybe they'll have feedback, or they'll have expectations and things that developers feel a little bit more uncomfortable with in the indie world. And then if you get your developer at the very end, ultimately, then you have way more control over your title, over its trajectory, over what the publisher is doing and not doing. I mean, doing it the way you guys are doing it, where it's later in the game, I think that is a good decision. That does pay off in the end, dividends. And I mean, usually indie games with publishers, the publisher really helps with porting, and they can make that a lot easier. And even localization for you guys, they can help with that too. So there's a lot of different
we've actually talked with quite a few publishers recently. Like after the Next Fest, a lot of them reached out to us. Our decision so far has been we want to keep the game entirely in our hands for Steam, right? For the primary release. We don't want to deal with any publishers, and then for the porting and so on, maybe that's where we would like a publisher to come in.
I see.
I'm not sure if I would be making the same kind of decision if we were like a larger team, because obviously if you're like 10 people or 20 people or something where your operating costs are very high, then getting a publisher and getting that extra financial security is definitely a lot more worth it. Just in our case, we're like 3 guys in the basement, and our budget is so fucking low that it didn't make that much sense to us. It doesn't make a huge difference. And plus, we kind of planned this game to do it on our own. We kind of set out with the idea to like scope it so we can pull it off ourselves, and we just didn't feel like getting a publisher in at this point made sense.
But I mean, with publishers, right, and even with that full release, talking about both of those questions kind of in tandem, releasing your game in the West versus releasing your game in the East versus releasing it even in Europe and Central Europe, there's different strategies. There's even different like restrictions if you're going into the East that you have to think about and pay attention to, from publishing your game, the audiences you're publishing to, and even like the monetary aspect of that release. So thinking on that, what was your guys' thoughts on all of those different markets and all of the different behaviors within those markets?
From our experience, like even today, most of your income is still kind of going to come from the US. Like looking at the other markets, obviously China is a very big like emerging market. Just the US is so much more consumerist. They just buy so many more games that even true, though they have a smaller population. And another thing is, US Americans are more likely to buy the game full price because they just have more disposable income. Like people from poorer countries, ourselves included, we're from Eastern Europe, from Bulgaria. So people from poorer countries usually buy games when they're discounted. This is even taking into account the regional price adjustment Steam. Considering all those things, America is obviously always your main source of income. And then from then on out, we're hoping to sell the game to like as many people as possible. We want to localize it to as many languages as possible. Already a lot of people in the community have reached out and offered to localize the game for free, which we're not okay with. Obviously, we want to pay them. So we do want to do localization. We're a small team, so that's one thing that's kind of hard to manage right now. But I think we're going to, we have the systems in place. So we definitely plan to do the localization. We're probably going to prioritize some languages that we're more familiar with to start with, and obviously bigger markets as well. But hopefully the game will be available in quite a few countries eventually. Outside of that, I know that there's a lot of selling your game to different markets. There's more there than just localizing, especially like places like China and so on, where I'm totally oblivious as to what kind of streamers are popular there, what YouTubers and so on. And so
they have completely different platform sets. Everything is separate. So,
it's a lot of work. We're gonna do it at an indie level, so as much as we can. Hopefully, Steam is a global platform, so hopefully it's good enough.
You'd mentioned kind of monetary adjustments throughout the world, and I think a lot of players are oblivious to that, and even the ones that know about it don't have a firm grasp on it, even me included. As you talk about something like that when you're selling a game, go into a little bit more detail on that. How does that affect your bottom line? I mean, as a developer, how does that kind of impact that?
Well, it's not like we planned for it. It's Steam doesn't force you to do this, by the way. The regional price adjustment is entirely optional, but you gotta do it because people give negative reviews if you don't do it. So it's better to have the price adjustment there. And I think it makes sense, especially as someone coming from a poor country. I totally agree that something which is a digital good, because when I'm selling a copy of a game, it doesn't cost me anything to produce that copy. So I think it does make sense that countries where people have less disposable income can still afford games. That's actually a great idea. And it's actually a great way to sell to markets where otherwise you would just have rampant piracy. Especially in Eastern Europe here, a lot of people pirate games, but when you account for the price adjustment, which there is, by the way, there is no price adjustment in Bulgaria for whatever reason, because we're in the EU. But let's say in Russia, like Russia, Poland, and so on, and Ukraine, Belarus, and so on, have a lot of problems with piracy.
Yeah.
But I think when you account for the price adjustments, it's quite possible that some people like spend money for games because they get so cheap, right?
Yeah.
It's a good thing. You can't really plan for it. It's just it's one of those things that lead up to the fact that the US is going to be your main market.
So EU countries, they don't have price adjustments?
Actually, I think games are more expensive here because I think the euro is slightly more expensive than the dollar. I'm not sure if that's the case right now. It used to be. Anyway, but yeah, like in Germany or France or Bulgaria, for some reason, games are the same price as they are in the US, but they're in euros.
Interesting. I never would have thought of that. The EU follows the same principles and rules as the US. And you're right. The euro does go up and down, but I think, that's a huge impact for you as a developer. So that's really interesting.
Well, it makes sense that the games are expensive in, let's say, Germany or Great Britain, because obviously they are countries with a higher standard of life. I wouldn't expect much of a price adjustment there, but it's strange that the whole EU has the same price tag for games, because not every country here is like average person in Bulgaria makes probably 1/3 of someone in Germany or something, or at least 1/2. Might be exaggerating.
I'm shocked by that. You would think they would have that for your guys' country.
No.
For Bulgaria, right? I think in Europe and even in the Middle East and some African countries right now, they're really pushing the limit on funding. So with your guys' country, is that something that you feel is an impact right now? Is that something that you can go out and you kind of have this community that you can rely on and talk to, grow and learn from?
Well, I'd say it's still pretty niche, but like what we're doing right now, I don't think it would be possible 15 years back or something. So for starters, the way we started making games, the game jams, like the fact that there was a game jam hosted on location in our city, pretty amazing, right? That's great. This happened when we were kids, by the way. That's how we didn't start making games there, but it really fueled our passion, right? And there, like, we're not a big hub for indie developers like some bigger EU countries, but there are other indie developers. Like there's, besides us in Plovdiv, there's like one other developer, Prime Games. He adapts game books to digital games. And when we were starting out with Kamifula, he gave us a lot of really good advice, which is the kind of advice you would take years to build up on your own. So that was a really big help.
I see.
If you go to like the bigger studios, there's even some of those here, like Ubisoft has a branch, there's Hemimont and so on. So there are big studios. It's not, it can definitely grow. So, but
it will.
I'm not sure about funding, by the way. I'm not sure about funding. I think there are some like investment funds for indie developers. I've heard of stuff like that. I think the EU also does funding, but that's a weird territory because the EU likes to fund like cultural artsy projects. So you'd have to be making, at least that's my impression. So you have to make like a game about Bulgarian history or some shit. Then you might get money from them.
That's it. I mean, EU, that's so interesting to me because like as I look through news feeds, I see the US, they do fund some of their indie projects, not as much as a lot of other countries, but they do it to a degree here. I think just the biggest, most recent example is I think Saudi Arabia pushed like it was like an 80 mil, or no, it was like 80 or 50 or some insane $1 billion amount towards their gaming industry, and it was like very, very noticeable that they're trying to make an impact on the industry moving forward. China's been doing it. I know that smaller European countries, I think like the Netherlands or Poland or like some of those countries in like Northern Europe, that they're trying to do it as well. And CD Projekt Red is from there, so obviously like there's some incentive, but I think it's becoming more natural for countries to try to push the limit on that, to push their game development and their gaming industry as a whole, so that ultimately they get more revenue back into their country because of that.
I am not as well educated on this subject as I should be.
Hey,
so there might be this insane grant just waiting for me that I haven't explored, because I don't read a lot of this stuff. Might check it out after this.
That's what I'm here for, right? We're expanding our thinking right now. Like I said, these kind of questions, like, they're so broad and it's so hard to kind of pin it down that all of a sudden you start digging into it and you're like, whoa, there's this and there's that, and like there's so much else that we didn't realize. So nowadays I think there's way more infrastructure than there's ever been for tools to use while you're developing a game, to just the support base for you and the monetary base even sometimes. So it's exciting. It's just an exciting time to be a developer, and also a very difficult time because of the competition and how many games are being released. So like I said, double-edged sword. There's always like that good and bad to everything. So I think with that in mind, with your guys' game, you'd mentioned localization, the UI on the back end. Do you have to kind of plan how you're going to be doing that ahead of time? You must, because I'd imagine like the US, English is very like condensed as a language, as opposed to, I don't know, Mandarin is much more extensive. So you got to leave way more room for that. There's all these like little different nuances and stuff, and even like French, Portuguese and things like that. Like they're very different languages. They all behave very different ways. So how do you approach that as a developer when you're creating a game?
I'd say if you're doing localization, it's good to plan for it from the start. I'm talking just from an engineering standpoint. Make sure your texts are localized. Yeah. There's always any sound assets that would be replaced. It's not that you can't do it later. It's that it would be super annoying too. Just a lot of busy work that you can save. It is a bit annoying during development, because every time you plug in a text, you gotta be like, look up the localization database, don't just hard code it, but it's worth the effort up front. Outside of that, I can't say we've planned very extensively for languages that might be too different, because like I know that like Arabic is read right to left, so like you said, Chinese maybe we might find that some texts won't fit or something like that. I think we'll just deal with it when the time comes.
That's fair.
Best we can do right now, I think.
Did you guys go into your game like, we're going to try to limit the dialogue just like so we can make localization more streamlined, especially coming from like a visual novel with so many words and so much going on?
No, but we should have.
Yeah.
It's just, some games they're so easy to localize. You just have the menu text and you're done, and that's beautiful. When you're a developer, you don't think about this, because it's you just want to make the best game possible.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where like, would have been nice if we just had to swap some menu text and then we had like 20 languages for free. Yeah. So next time when you're choosing what game to make, when you're weighing in the positives and negatives of each idea, consider this. Like, how easy is it to localize?
Yeah, especially nowadays, right? No, that's funny. Yeah. All right, so with this game, we've talked about a lot of different aspects of the industry and a little bit about this game as a whole. What should players know? Like, what's the elevator pitch for this game? What should players know about it? What makes it different? Talk about that a little bit with me. The game worlds, the inventory system, the main character, like all those different like little things that you guys are pushing with this game.
Dead Must Die is a sort of bullet haven roguelite, which is very reminiscent of Diablo and Hades and so on. So we have very crisp pixel art. The game looks very nice, I think. We have some very hectic actiony gameplay, and we have a lot of grind. So we're overhauling the item systems. Check it out. Just skim through the Steam page. I think if it grabs your eye, it might just be your thing. Maybe try the demo.
With that in mind, I think segueing to the industry as a whole, as the industry expands, right? We have NFTs, we have esports, which has already been relevant, but it's becoming even more relevant. You have the metaverse, you have augmented reality gaming. Like, there's a lot of different things and trends going on right now that are different than they have ever been, that are more relevant than they've ever been. For you as a developer, when you look at the industry a decade from now, when you look at the industry even 5 years from now, what's something you see that's going to be like very impactful on developers, on players, on the industry as a whole?
I'm a bit stuck in the past, wherein I don't care too much about like tech innovation and stuff like that. Especially as someone who really likes retro games, and some of my favorite periods in gaming are like early 2000s and so on. Yeah, I'd say that VR, like I know this is crazy because VR is kind of dying off, right? This is just a friend of mine's crazy idea, is that since kind of Apple is going into that, we might have like a burst of like sort of expansion in the market there.
Okay.
Because oftentimes when Apple goes into a new market, they kind of even though they're not the first there, they kind of build it up. So I'm not sure this is gonna actually happen because I don't even have a VR headset, but there might be a period where VR games are kind of lucrative. I don't really care, to be honest, because I'm still gonna be making the kind of games I like.
That's fair.
But I guess outside of that, for indies, it will be interesting to see, because one thing I'm really lacking right now in the industry is I miss the middle-sized studios, right? Because there was a period like early 2000s and so on where you had AAA, but you had like the big studios were kind of more likely to invest in mid-sized games, where you still had a budget, but you were more prone to experimenting. Whilst right now what we have is we have this big separation where you have the huge ass AAA games, which are just super expensive, but are kind of, I think, somewhat soulless. It feels like they're converging on one design, all of them, zero experimentation. They're very, very corporatized. And on the other end, you have indies, which are like super creative, super innovative, but they're just like very small. There's a limit to how much you can do when you're like 5 guys, right? So what I really miss are like the mid-sized teams, like 20 people, let's say, right? Not a huge ass studio, but 20 people. And I feel like this is already happening where there are more and more studios that are kind of growing out of the indie scene, where they started off small, but they gradually have the manpower and the funds to actually make bigger games. And that's my favorite space, because you both have ambition and the capacity to pull through. So that's what I want to see from the industry, and what I'm hoping is we'll see in the coming years.
It's a good take. I like that. For me, I think, and this is a question to you, as well as kind of my thoughts on the industry. Right now, as an indie player, or even as an indie developer, there's limited spaces where you can release your game. You can release it through the traditional avenues, which is usually Steam or Epic, which is kind of dying. There's not a lot of other platforms out there that you can really lean into. There's itch.io and a couple others. But down the road in 5-10 years, do you see the industry expanding where there's a lot of different platforms where developers can launch their games on? Or do you think that's something that's never really going to take off because it's always kind of going to get, there's not enough of a foothold those smaller websites and platforms can get where they can stay lucrative and keep going because of Steam and Epic and itch and all these other platforms out there?
If we're just talking the PC market, I don't see Steam losing its throne. I just think it's the nature of how these platforms work, because when you have your whole library in Steam, that new platform is gonna have to be really amazing to get you out of Steam.
That's fair.
Epic tried this. Like, Epic literally threw millions, they threw billions into this. Like, they got so many exclusive deals. They were giving away free games, and they still couldn't dethrone Steam. So I don't see a small platform doing that. There are some niche platforms like GOG for older games and stuff. I don't think it's gonna go away. Like, the only thing I can think of is if some platform comes along and it's offering a different service. Like, I know right now you have this subscription style stuff like Xbox Game Pass. If something like that catches on, which is like different enough from Steam to get people on board, then it might work. But other than that, how do you get people out of Steam?
And then there's markets like we mentioned, the Chinese market. They do have Steam. I think they have other gaming platforms as well that for the life of me, I don't know what they're called or how they work or anything along that line. Like, I guess it is regional as well. For your game moving forward into the end of this year, right? Moving into next year even, you talked about early access. So what does your roadmap look like from here going into, I guess, even the beginning of 2024? Like, what's that look like for you guys?
So yeah, early access sometime this year. Can't say we have a super strict roadmap, because we kind of just go with the flow. Not very professional of us, of course, but
it's an indie studio. Make your own rules.
What we have planned for the early access, we sort of imagine a sort of stream of patches, but where each patch is kind of big, right? We release a patch, take some time off, right, where we're just bug fixing and stuff like that, and then let's say in a month or so we release another big patch with, let's say, a new level, more enemies and so on. So we just have a huge list of these content chunks that we want to add to the game leading up to release. I imagine we're going to be in early access for about a year, but it might be more than that. So I don't know.
Okay. Do you guys already have like a third game in mind right now? It's already in the back of your head where you're like, I can't wait. We're going to start it soon. Or is it all hands on deck for Death Must Die and that's it right now?
Well, I have a lot of games in the back of my head because, when inspiration strikes, you just write it down. But
that's fair.
we're not doing pre-production on anything else, obviously. We don't have the resources for that.
That makes sense. I get that. Well, outside of that, is there anything that you would want to touch on? Anything you feel like needs, discussed about the game? Something we missed? Anything along that line?
I guess one thing I might say for indie developers listening to this, because I kind of touched on some of these marketing things. There's this guy, Chris Zukolski, who talks about game marketing a lot. Mm-hmm. And he has a ton of free lectures and stuff. It's How to Market a Game, it's called, I think. So that really helped us a lot in kind of thinking about how we're going to make our games and marketing and so on. So I suggest anyone check that out, because I touched on these things, but I obviously wasn't very exhaustive when speaking about it.